The wind came first, a low moan across the plains that rattled the bones of Redemption Gulch. Then came the dust. It rose in a solid wall of ochre and rust, a churning beast that swallowed the horizon and blotted out the midday sun. Within minutes, the world shrank to the length of Main Street, a corridor of swirling grit where lamps had to be lit against an artificial twilight. Doors slammed shut, windows were barred, and the town held its breath. Inside the Redemption Savings and Trust, the air was thick with the scent of stale paper metal and fear. Elias, a rancher whose 50-odd years were carved into his face like canyons in the earth, stood in line, his hat clutched in his hands. He was not a town man. The polished floors and gilded teller cages felt alien beneath his worn leather boots. He was here for one reason, the last of his savings, a meager sum he hoped would be enough to buy feed for his dwindling herd and keep the Lone Pine Ranch from turning to dust like everything else. The drought had been relentless, a slow, thirsty killer, and this money was his final stand. The line shuffled forward. Elias's gaze drifted past the nervous teller to the street outside where the storm raged. The dust wasn't just weather. It was a judgment. It scoured the paint from buildings, choked the wells, and ground hope into a fine, bitter powder. Suddenly, the bank's heavy oak doors burst inward with a deafening crack. Two men, their faces wrapped in bandanas, stormed the lobby, shotguns leveled. Panic erupted. A woman screamed, a chair clattered to the floor. The townsfolk dove for cover, a scrambling tide of terror. But a third man filled the doorway, and his presence silenced the room more effectively than any gunshot. He was tall and dressed in a tailored black coat that seemed to repel the dust swirling around him. He moved with an unhurried, predatory grace, his boots making no sound on the floorboards. He pulled down his bandana, revealing a handsome, clean-shaven face and eyes as cold and gray as a winter sky. It was Silas Blackwood. He wasn't some common outlaw. He was the owner of the sprawling Black Creek Ranch, a man who had been buying up failing properties with a seemingly endless supply of cash. His influence was a shadow that stretched over the entire county. "Ladies and gentlemen," Blackwood said, his voice calm and resonant, carrying easily over the howl of the wind. "This is a simple transaction. Your cooperation will ensure it remains so." His men moved with brutal efficiency, stuffing cash from the teller drawers into canvas sacks. Elias lay flat on the floor, his face pressed against the cool wood, his mind racing. The money for his ranch was gone. It was over. He felt a hollow ache spread through his chest, the final weary surrender to a fate he'd fought for years. Then Blackwood's polished boots stopped inches from his face. Elias didn't move, didn't breathe. He could feel the man's gaze on him, cold and appraising. "Get up, old man," Blackwood commanded. Slowly, reluctantly, Elias pushed himself to his feet. He kept his eyes down, a gesture of submission he hoped would be enough. But Blackwood's attention wasn't on his face. It was fixed on the thin silver chain around his neck. With a flick of his wrist, Blackwood reached out and snatched it. The chain snapped. Dangling from his fingers was a small, tarnished silver locket. Elias's head shot up, his heart seizing in his chest. "No," he rasped, the word torn from him. "Not that. Take anything else." Blackwood's lips curved into a smile that held no warmth. He popped the locket open with his thumb. Inside, behind two tiny panes of scratched glass, were two faded portraits, one of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, his late wife Eleanor, and the other of a young girl with a rebellious spark in her gaze, his daughter Mary, as he last remembered her. The sight of their faces in that man's hand was a violation deeper than any theft of coin. It was the theft of memory, of love, of a life that was no more. Blackwood looked from the locket to Elias, and for a fleeting moment, a flicker of chilling recognition crossed his features. It was a look that said, this was not random, not a crime of opportunity. It was personal. He snapped the locket shut, the sound like a final gunshot in the silent room. "A man shouldn't carry what he can't protect," Silas Blackwood said, his voice a low murmur meant only for Elias. He pocketed the locket, turned on his heel, and strode out of the bank, his men following close behind. They vanished into the roaring dust as quickly as they had appeared, leaving behind a shattered door, terrified silence, and a hollowed-out man standing in the center of the room, his hand clutching the empty space on his chest where his heart used to be. The money was gone, the ranch was lost, but that was nothing. Blackwood had taken his past, and in doing so had declared a war Elias didn't yet understand. The storm passed as dusk settled, leaving the world coated in a fine red film. Redemption Gulch exhaled, but the air remained thick with unease. Elias found Sheriff Brody at his desk, in the jailhouse boots propped up methodically, cleaning his fingernails with the tip of a Bowie knife. The office smelled of stale coffee and apathy. Brody was a man who had long ago made peace with the idea that his authority was a suggestion, not a command. He listened to Elias's account of the robbery, with a practiced patience, his expression unchanging. When Elias got to the part about the locket and who had taken it, Brody finally lowered his feet to the floor with a weary thud. "Silas Blackwood," he said, his voice laced with disbelief and a deep-seated reluctance. "Elias, are you sure the dust was thick? A man can mistake another in that kind of weather." It was him, Elias insisted, his voice raw. "He looked me in the eye. He spoke to me." Brody sighed and ran a hand over his balding head. "Blackwood owns half this county. He's got more money in that bank than was stolen today. Why would he rob it?" He leaned forward, his tone shifting from dismissive to cautionary. "Listen to me. You're a good man, but you're grieving. You're struggling. It's easy to see shadows where there aren't any. Making an accusation like that against a man like Blackwood, it's not just foolish, it's dangerous." Elias stared at the sheriff, at the deliberate refusal to see the practiced cowardice that passed for law in this town. He saw it was useless. Brody wasn't just ineffective. He was a gatekeeper paid in peace to look the other way while men like Blackwood did as they pleased. He turned without another word and walked out, the weight of his isolation settling on his shoulders like a shroud. The law would not help him. He was alone. The ride back to the Lone Pine Ranch was a journey through a graveyard of dreams. The land was parched, the grass brittle and brown. His cattle were bony specters haunting a landscape of cracked earth. The ranch house, once filled with the warmth of Eleanor's laughter and the whirlwind of a young Mary, was now just a silent, hollow shell. He stabled his horse and walked into the quiet kitchen. The air was still and heavy with memory. He ran a hand over the worn wood of the kitchen table where Eleanor had served 1,000 meals, where Mary had done her lessons. Every corner of the house was a ghost. He had lost Eleanor to a fever a decade ago, a swift and merciless illness that had stolen the light from his world. But Mary he had lost differently. She had left 5 years ago after a bitter argument. He could no longer clearly recall something about her future, his stubbornness, her fierce desire for a life beyond the dust and hardship of the ranch. She'd packed a small bag and was gone by morning, leaving only a note on the table that said she was sorry. He'd heard she'd found work in a town a few counties over, but pride and pain had kept him from reaching out. The silence between them had stretched from weeks into years, a chasm of unspoken words. The locket had been his last tangible connection to them both, a promise that the family he'd built hadn't been a dream. Now that too was gone. Days bled into weeks. Elias worked from sunup to sundown, a grim mechanical routine designed to keep thought at bay. He fixed fences that bordered nothing of value and drew water from a well that was nearly dry. On his rare trips into town for supplies, he saw Blackwood moving through the streets of Redemption Gulch like a king surveying his domain. The man radiated a confident power that made townsfolk avert their eyes. It was on one of these trips that Elias first noticed the new girl. She was working at the saloon, wiping tables, a quiet presence in a loud room. She had a hopeful, determined set to her chin, but her eyes were wary, as if she were constantly scanning for threats. Her name, he learned, was Lydia. She was saving money, trying to build a new life for herself after some unspoken hardship back east. He saw her a few times after that. Once at the general store, where they exchanged a brief, pleasant nod. Another time he saw her speaking with the county clerk, her finger tracing a line on an old map of land deeds. She was looking for a small plot to buy a place to put down roots. A flicker of his daughter Mary, in her ambition and her quiet resilience, stirred something in him, a forgotten paternal ache. He found himself hoping she'd find her piece of land, that this unforgiving country wouldn't break her. Then one afternoon he saw her talking to Silas Blackwood outside the saloon. Blackwood was smiling, his charm on full display, his hand gesturing toward the hills where his own ranch sprawled. Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. Blackwood wasn't just buying land. He was consuming the town, its people, its hopes. And now he had his sights set on the one flicker of new life Redemption Gulch had seen in years. The message arrived a few days later, delivered not by word or letter, but by an act of unimaginable cruelty. One of Elias's last remaining ranch hands, a young man named Jake, came galloping into the yard, his face pale with horror. "Elias, by the well, you have to come quick." Elias ran, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone what he would find. And still the sight of it stopped him cold. She was lying at the edge of the old stone well, a broken doll tossed aside. It was Lydia. Her dress was torn to shreds, her skin a canvas of raw, bleeding gashes and deep purple bruises. The dust of the trail was caked into her wounds, her hair matted with blood and dirt. A length of frayed rope was still tied tight around one wrist, the fibers embedded in her raw flesh. She was barely breathing, her chest rising in shallow, ragged shudders. She had been dragged for miles and left here on his land at his well. This wasn't a random attack by some passing drifter. This was a statement. This was Blackwood showing him with vicious, eloquent clarity what happened to things he found beautiful, what happened to hope in a land that he owned. It was a message scrawled in another human being's suffering, meant only for him. He had taken the symbol of Elias's past, and now he had savaged the only thing that had reminded him of a possible future. Kneeling beside her, his hands trembling, Elias felt a rage so pure and cold it burned away years of grief and resignation. This was no longer about a locket or a failing ranch. This was about a line that had been crossed, a debt of pain that had been issued and now must be collected. Elias carried Lydia into the quiet dimness of his home, her slight weight a profound burden. He laid her gently on Mary's old bed, the mattress sighing under the unexpected load. For a moment, the past and present collided, the ghost of his daughter and the broken body of this stranger, intertwined in a tragedy he was only beginning to comprehend. He worked with a grim focus, born of necessity. His hands, calloused from a lifetime of ranch work, surprisingly gentle. He cleaned her wounds with water from the basin, his touch careful, clinical. He cut away the remnants of her dress and covered her with a clean white sheet, a gesture of dignity in the face of profound violation. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her breath a faint hitching sound in the silent room. In her delirium, she murmured fragmented words, her body twitching as if still fighting an unseen enemy. He sat in a chair by the bed, a sentinel in the long, dark hours of the night, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest, a fragile testament to her will to survive. The next afternoon, Sheriff Brody's buggy kicked up a plume of dust as it rolled into the yard. He ambled onto the porch, his expression one of deep inconvenience. Elias met him at the door, blocking the entrance. "Heard you found some trouble out here," Brody said, peering past him into the house. "A girl was left for dead on my property," Elias stated, his voice flat and hard. Brody took off his hat and wiped his brow. Jake came into town, told me the story. Sounds awful. Drifters, most likely. This country's full of them. Vicious with nothing to lose. He made a show of scanning the horizon, his eyes deliberately avoiding the massive sprawling brand of Black Creek Ranch, burned into a fence post not 20 yards away. Elias didn't move. It wasn't drifters. Now Elias Brody began his tone patronizing. We've been through this. You can't go blaming Silas Blackwood for every misfortune that befalls this county. She was last seen talking to him, Elias pressed. He offered her a job. Days later, she's found like this. On my land. That's not a coincidence. Brody's face hardened. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. I'm going to give you some advice as a friend. You drop this. You nurse that girl back to health, and when she's well enough, you put her on a stagecoach heading anywhere but here. There are fights you can't win, Elias. This is one of them. He clapped a hand on Elias's shoulder, a gesture meant to be reassuring but felt like a threat. I'll file a report. Random drifter attack. Case closed. He turned and walked back to his buggy without ever asking to see Lydia, without ever stepping inside the house. Elias watched him go, the dust settling behind him, and the full extent of his solitude became terrifyingly clear. The law was not just blind. It was complicit. He and the girl in his house were utterly, completely alone. He returned to Lydia's bedside. Her eyes were open, lucid for the first time. They were filled with a profound, animal terror. When she saw him, she flinched, trying to shrink away into the thin mattress. It's all right, Elias said softly, keeping his distance. You're safe here. The words seemed to have little effect. Her breathing quickened, her gaze darting around the room, as if expecting an attack from the shadows. He spent the next few days patiently earning her trust. He brought her broth and water, leaving it on a small table by the bed, and retreating so she could eat without feeling watched. He spoke to her in a low, calm voice, telling her about the ranch and the weather, meaningless things that filled the oppressive silence. Slowly, the terror in her eyes began to recede, replaced by a deep, hollowed-out weariness. One evening, as he brought her a fresh glass of water, she spoke, her voice a raw whisper. He said if I ever told anyone what I saw, he would find me. She choked out, tears streaming down her face. He said he would do this again, but next time, he wouldn't stop. He said he'd do it to anyone who helped me. Elias pulled the chair closer, his expression grim. What did you see, Lydia? She shook her head violently, her body trembling. I can't. He'll know. He saw then that her silence was a cage built of fear, and Blackwood held the key. He would have to find another way to unlock the truth. Elias realized he couldn't force the story from her. It would have to surface on its own time. His role was to provide the safety she needed for that to happen. He had to become the one thing this world had denied her, a protector. He would have to uncover the truth himself, piece by piece, even if it meant walking into the shadow of the most powerful man in the county. The investigation began not with a gun, but with quiet conversations in the dusty corners of Redemption Gulch. Elias knew that a man like Blackwood, who built an empire on fear, would leave a trail of disgruntled and terrified people in his wake. His first stop was Doc Miller, a man who had been patching up the town's residents for 40 years. The doctor's office, tucked behind the mercantile, smelled of antiseptic and old secrets. Miller was a stooped, wary man with eyes that had seen too much. He listened as Elias spoke, his hands methodically cleaning a set of surgical tools. I can't help you, Elias, he said. When the story was finished, his gaze fixed on the gleaming steel in his hands. Getting involved with Blackwood is a death sentence. You've treated his men? Elias pressed his voice low. Ranch hands get hurt. Fights, falls. You must have seen things, heard things. The doctor paused, his knuckles white around a scalpel. He glanced toward the closed door and then leaned in closer. A few years back, he whispered, one of his foremen brought in a girl. Young. Said she'd fallen from a horse. The injuries, they didn't match that story. She had bruises on her wrists, her neck. I patched her up as best I could. When I asked her what really happened, the foreman gave me a look that told me to forget I'd ever seen her. She was gone the next day. Vanished. He straightened up his face, a mask of professional detachment once more. That's all I know. It's more than I should have told you. Now get out of here before someone sees you. His next stop was a saloon at the edge of town. A grimy establishment where men who had been chewed up and spat out by Blackwood's operation went to drown their resentments. He found a former Black Creek ranch hand named Cletus, nursing a cheap whiskey, his face a roadmap of bar fights and bad decisions. It took 2 rounds of drinks and the promise of a third before Cletus would talk. Blackwood, he slurred, spitting on the floor. He ain't human. He's a damn ghost. Showed up here maybe 10 years ago. Didn't have 2 cents to rub together, folks said. Then sudden like he's got a chest full of gold. Bought the old Miller homestead and just grew. Black Creek ain't a ranch. It's a fortress. Men with rifles on the ridges. No one gets in or out without him knowing. Did you ever hear him talk about an old debt, Elias asked, leaning in? Or a place called Whispering Canyon? Cletus's bloodshot eyes widened in fear. He shook his head frantically. Don't you say that name? That place is cursed. Bad things happen there. Blackwood takes men there they don't come back from. He drained his glass, slammed it on the bar, and stumbled away, refusing to say another word. Meanwhile, back at the Lone Pine, Lydia was slowly mending. The physical wounds were beginning to heal, but the deeper scars remained. Nightmares still plagued her, waking her with choked screams. Yet with each passing day, a little more of her strength returned. She began to help Elias with small chores, her movements tentative at first, then more confident. The simple rhythm of work seemed to ground her, pulling her out of the fog of her trauma. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun bleed across the sky, she spoke, her voice quiet but clear. He was talking to his foreman. She began, her eyes fixed on the distant horizon. I wasn't supposed to hear. He was angry. He said something about an old debt finally coming due. He mentioned Redemption Gulch and a name. Your name, Elias. Elias felt a cold dread seep into his bones. This confirmed it. It was all connected. She continued, her voice trembling slightly. The place where he took me. Before. It was behind the main barn. The ground was soft. He had me digging a new post hole. My shovel hit something. It was a cloth bundle. She swallowed hard, reliving the moment. I thought it was just old rags. But inside, there was a dress. Like mine, but old and rotted. And something else. She looked at him, her eyes wide with the horror of the memory. He was always talking about Whispering Canyon. He said it was a place where secrets go to stay buried. The memory seemed to trigger another. She stood up abruptly and walked toward the small barn behind Elias's house. He followed, his heart pounding. She led him to a corner, to a loose floorboard she must have noticed during her chores. She pried it up. Reaching inside, she pulled out a small dirt-caked object and held it out to him on her trembling palm. It was a small wooden bird, crudely carved, but with a distinct familiar shape. The wings were slightly uneven, the tail notched in a pattern only one person would know. Elias's breath caught in his throat. He felt the world tilt on its axis. He took the bird, his calloused fingers tracing the worn grooves in the wood. He knew every line, every imperfection. He had carved it himself 15 years ago from a piece of fallen pine. He had carved it for his daughter Mary on her 10th birthday. She had treasured it, carried it with her everywhere. It was the one thing he was certain she would have taken with her when she left. and Lydia had found it buried on Blackwood's property alongside a tattered dress. The wooden bird in his hand was not just an object. It was a key unlocking a floodgate of memory and a truth more terrible than he could have imagined. He saw himself as a younger man, sitting on the porch of this very house, the sun warm on his back. Mary, a girl with fire in her spirit, and her mother's eyes sat beside him, watching his pocket knife peel away slivers of pine. He remembered the feel of the wood, the scent of the sap, the look of pure joy on her face when he placed the finished bird in her hands. "So it can fly away with all your secrets, little bird," he had told her. The memory was so vivid, it was painful, a shard of a life that felt a world away. Now holding the bird, its wood stained by the earth of Blackwood's ranch, the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with horrifying certainty. Lydia hadn't just stumbled upon evidence of a random murder. She had unearthed the final brutal chapter of his own daughter's story. That night, with Lydia asleep in the other room, Elias sat in the dark kitchen, the wooden bird on the table before him, and finally allowed himself to confront the ghosts he had kept locked away. Blackwood. The name had meant nothing to him before, but now he dredged up a memory from over a decade ago, long before Blackwood had appeared in Redemption Gulch. He'd been part of a posse, a reluctant duty he'd undertaken after a gang of rustlers had hit several ranches in the territory, including his own. They'd tracked the gang for days, a hard, grueling ride. The final confrontation had been a bloody mess in a rocky pass. Shots fired in panic and confusion. When the smoke cleared, most of the gang were captured or dead. Elias remembered one of them, a young reckless kid no older than 20 who had been killed in the crossfire. His name was Daniel Quinn. His older brother, the leader of the gang, had been captured. His name was Silas Quinn. Silas Quinn, not Silas Blackwood. He'd changed his name, built a new identity. He had been sent to prison, but he must have gotten out his heart black with a thirst for vengeance, a vengeance he aimed squarely at the men in the posse. And Elias, a simple rancher who had only been there to recover his own property, had become the focus of that hatred. It all made a sickening kind of sense. Blackwood's arrival, his systematic destruction of the ranches around Redemption Gulch, likely belonging to other members of that long-forgotten posse. And Mary, his daughter, hadn't just run away. Blackwood had gotten to her first. He hadn't just killed her. That would have been too simple, too merciful for a man whose revenge was a slow, meticulously crafted poison. No, he would have destroyed her first. The doctor's story of the battered girl, the whispers of her reputation being ruined before she disappeared. It was all Blackwood's work. He had turned the town against her, isolated her, made her an outcast. Then, when she had nowhere left to turn, he had taken her to Whispering Canyon and buried her along with the little wooden bird he'd once carved for her. And Lydia. The dragging, the terror leaving her at his well. It wasn't just a message. It was a twisted reenactment. A cruel psychological torture designed to make Elias relive the horror of what had happened to his own daughter. Blackwood wasn't just trying to ruin him. He was trying to break his soul. The conflict wasn't about a locket or land or money. It was about a brother's blood spilled in the dust years ago, and a vendetta that had festered in the dark heart of a patient, monstrous man. The knowledge changed him. The grief that had bowed his shoulders for years hardened into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. He now knew his enemy's name, his history, his motive, and he knew what he had to do. But Blackwood was a predator who sensed when his prey was no longer afraid. He must have seen the change in Elias's eyes during his next trip to town, or heard the whispers that the old rancher was asking questions. The retaliation was swift and suffocating. It began at the general store. Elias went to buy his usual sack of flour and coffee, but Mr. Henderson, the proprietor he'd known for 20 years, refused to look him in the eye. "I'm sorry," Elias Henderson mumbled, polishing an already spotless counter. "Your credit is no longer good here. Cash only." "My credit has always been good here," Elias said, stunned. Henderson finally looked up, his eyes pleading. A new directive came down from the bank. The bank Mr. Blackwood now holds the note on. I've got a family to feed, Elias. My hands are tied. The next blow came a few days later. In the dead of night, the roar of stampeding cattle woke him. He and Lydia rushed outside to see the last of his herd being driven off a short cliff by two of Blackwood's riders, their silhouettes stark against the moonlight. By morning, all he had left were a handful of broken carcasses at the bottom of the ravine. It wasn't just the loss of the animals. It was the final definitive end of the Lone Pine Ranch. It was over. The whispers in town grew louder, poisoned by Blackwood's influence. Elias was no longer a grieving father. He was a crazed old man driven mad by hardship, nursing a dangerous obsession with a respected citizen. People who once offered a sympathetic nod now crossed the street to avoid him. Doors closed as he approached. He and Lydia were pariahs, completely and utterly isolated. The town, in its fear, had chosen its side. One evening, Lydia found him sitting on the porch, staring out at the ruined ranch, the weight of his defeat a palpable thing. He's trying to break you, she said quietly, standing beside him. He already has, Elias replied, his voice hollow. The ranch is gone. The town is against us. There's nowhere to turn. Lydia looked at him, her gaze steady and clear. The frightened girl he had found by the well was gone, replaced by a woman forged in trauma and tempered by resolve. That's not true, she said. When you found me, I had nothing. I was less than nothing. You gave me a clean dress, a safe place. You showed me that one person's decency can stand against cruelty. He hasn't broken you, Elias. He's shown you what you're fighting for. She looked toward the dark outline of the canyon in the distance. You said there's nowhere to turn, but there's one place left to go. The place where the truth is buried. Her words cut through his despair. She was right. He had been thinking about what he had lost. It was time to think about what he had to reclaim. Giving up was no longer an option. Blackwood had made this a fight to the death. He wanted to take everything from Elias to leave him with nothing. But he had made one critical mistake. He had left him Lydia, and in doing so, he had given him an ally. They were alone against the world, but they were together. He had to face Blackwood not with the law which had failed him, but with the raw, uncompromising justice of the frontier. A storm was gathering in the west, the sky bruised purple and black. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with electricity. It was the perfect night for ghosts. Elias cleaned and oiled his old Colt revolver, the movements practiced and deliberate. Lydia stood in the doorway watching him. She held out a small, heavy leather-bound book. I found this in the bundle with the bird, she said. I didn't understand what it was until now. Elias took it. It was a ledger. He flipped through the pages. It was a meticulous record of Blackwood's acquisitions, bribes, and threats, a detailed account of his criminal empire, including names, dates, and amounts. It was the proof they needed the weapon that could dismantle everything Blackwood had built. This changes things, Elias said, a grim hope sparking within him. No, Lydia corrected him gently. It finishes things. But you have to face him first. For Mary, he nodded. He tucked the ledger into his saddlebag. There was only one place this could end. Whispering Canyon was a jagged scar in the earth, a place of twisted rock and stunted junipers, where the wind howled with a mournful human sound. As Elias rode into its mouth, the storm broke. Rain fell in blinding sheets, turning the ground to a slick, treacherous mud. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the canyon walls in stark, terrifying flashes. He found Blackwood waiting for him in a small clearing sheltered by a rock overhang. He was standing beside a freshly dug mound of earth, a shovel resting at his feet. He held a lantern in one hand and a pistol in the other, its barrel aimed squarely at Elias's chest. I knew you'd come. Blackwood said, his voice calm amidst the tempest. A man always returns to the grave of what he loves. Elias dismounted his boots, sinking into the mud. The rain plastered his hair to his scalp, streaming down his face. Her name was Mary, he said, his voice a low growl. Blackwood smiled, a chilling sight in the flickering lantern light. I know. I got to know her very well before the end. He gestured with his gun toward the mound of earth. I thought it was only fitting that the man responsible for her death should be the one to give her a proper burial. Pick up the shovel, Elias. Dig. Rage and grief warred within Elias, but the gun in Blackwood's hand left him no choice. He picked up the heavy mud-caked shovel and began to dig. The work was agonizing, each shovelful of wet earth feeling like a piece of his own soul. The storm raged around them, a symphony of nature's fury, mirroring the tempest in his heart. As he dug, Blackwood delivered his monologue, savoring every word. My brother Danny worshipped me. He began, his voice rising over the wind. He was reckless, but he had a good heart. You and your posse. You gunned him down like a dog. For what a few bony cows I swore on his grave, that I would take everything from every man who rode that day. And I saved you for last. I wanted your suffering to be a masterpiece. I didn't just want to kill your daughter. I wanted to erase her. I spread rumors, turned her friends against her, made her feel so alone in the world, that when I offered her a kindness, she walked right into my arms. Elias's shovel struck something soft. He froze. Blackwood gestured with the gun. Keep digging. With trembling hands, Elias cleared the dirt. It was a skeleton clad in the rotting remains of a dress identical to the one Lydia had found. He fell to his knees, a raw animal cry of anguish torn from his throat. Blackwood laughed, a sound as cruel as the howling wind. Now you know a fraction of my pain. He raised his pistol, taking careful aim at Elias's head. Your debt is paid. Suddenly, a piercing whistle cut through the storm's roar. High on the canyon rim above them, a figure stood silhouetted by a flash of lightning. It was Lydia. She had followed him. With a heave, she shoved a large, precariously balanced boulder over the edge. It wasn't aimed at them, but at the scree slope beside them. The boulder crashed down, starting an avalanche of rock and mud that thundered down the canyon wall. Blackwood, startled, glanced up for a split second. It was the only opening Elias needed. He lunged not at the gun, but at the man tackling him with the full force of his grief and fury. They crashed into the mud, wrestling for the pistol. It went off the shot, swallowed by a clap of thunder. Elias, powered by a strength he didn't know he possessed, smashed Blackwood's hand against a rock until the gun fell from his grasp. He pinned him to the ground, his hands closing around Blackwood's throat. She is not dead, Blackwood rasped, his eyes wide with a desperate, triumphant cunning. Elias paused, his grip tightening. Liar. The grave. It's the girl from the doctor's story. Blackwood choked out the rain, washing the mud from his face. A warning? A dress rehearsal? Mary. Mary is still alive. I have her hidden away. Safe. And I'm the only one who knows where she is. Kill me, Elias, and you will never see your daughter again. The words hit Elias like a physical blow. He stared down at the man who had destroyed his life, the man he wanted to kill more than he wanted to draw his next breath. And he was faced with a terrible, impossible choice: justice for the past or hope for the future. Kill the monster or save his child. The rage receded, replaced by a cold, desperate clarity. Killing Blackwood would be an ending, but it would be the wrong one. Vengeance would be a hollow victory if it cost him his daughter forever. With a final guttural roar of frustration, Elias released his grip. He grabbed the length of rope from his saddle and with brutal efficiency bound Blackwood's hands and feet. Where is she? Elias demanded, his face inches from Blackwood's. Blackwood, sensing his victory, sneered. Why should I tell you? Elias grabbed the fallen pistol from the mud, cocked it, and pressed the cold, wet barrel against Blackwood's temple. "Because I have nothing left to lose? I'll give you to the count of 3 to tell me where she is. If you don't, I'll kill you, and I'll spend the rest of my life looking for her myself." 1. The sneer on Blackwood's face faltered. He saw the truth in Elias's eyes. This was not a bluff. 2. Panic flickered in Blackwood's gaze. His own life was still worth more to him than his revenge. "The old San Cristobal mission," he blurted out. "North of here, in the foothills. She's there." He spat a muddy wad of saliva. "She's weak. Been locked away for years. She's probably forgotten your face." Elias stood holstering the pistol. He looked up at the canyon rim where Lydia had been. She was gone. He knew what she was doing. She was riding for help the ledger in her saddlebag, the proof that would bring the law whether Brody wanted it or not. He left Blackwood tied and helpless in the rain, a pathetic figure stripped of his power. Mounting his horse, Elias turned not toward Redemption Gulch, but north toward the foothills. The ride was a desperate, frantic prayer. Every mile was an agony of hope and fear. Was she alive? Would she be whole? What had years of captivity done to her? The San Cristobal mission was a crumbling adobe ruin, a skeleton of a building bleached by the sun. He found her in a small windowless room in the back, the heavy door barred from the outside. When he broke it open, she was huddled in the corner, a pale, thin figure in a simple gray dress. Her hair was long and unkempt, her eyes wide and fearful in the sudden light. She looked at him not with recognition, but with the cautious terror of a creature long caged. "Mary," he whispered, his voice breaking. Her head tilted. The name seemed to stir a distant echo. She was weaker, thinner, but it was her. It was his daughter. He took a slow step forward, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "It's me," he said, his heart aching. "It's your father, Elias." He saw a flicker in her eyes, a memory fighting its way through years of darkness and isolation. Her lips parted, and a single fragile word escaped. "Papa." He closed the distance between them and knelt, wrapping his arms around her frail body. She was stiff at first, then slowly she collapsed against him, her shoulders shaking with sobs that had been held back for 5 long years. He held her tight, his own tears mixing with the rain on his face. A father reunited with his lost child in the ruins of the past. By the time they returned to the Lone Pine, the sun was rising. A posse led by a grim-faced Lydia and a profoundly reluctant Sheriff Brody was riding out. Faced with the ledger's undeniable evidence and the fury of a town that had finally woken up, Brody had been left with no choice. They found Blackwood where Elias had left him, and the reign of Silas Quinn came to a quiet, muddy end. Months passed. The autumn rains came washing the dust from the air and breathing new life into the thirsty land. The empire Silas Blackwood had built on, fear crumbled. With the evidence in the ledger, federal marshals arrived, and his network of corruption was dismantled piece by piece. Redemption. Gulch, free from his shadow, began to heal. So did the Lone Pine Ranch. It was no longer a place of ghosts, but one of quiet, steady rebuilding. Mary's recovery was slow. The years of captivity had left deep wounds, but the resilience Elias remembered from her childhood was still there, a stubborn ember that refused to be extinguished. Day by day she grew stronger, the light returning to her eyes. Lydia stayed. She had arrived in the West seeking a place to put down roots, and in the most unlikely of circumstances, she had found not just a home, but a family. The bond forged between her and Mary was immediate and fierce, a sisterhood of survivors. Together, the 3 of them worked the ranch. They bought a few new head of cattle, planted a small garden, and mended the fences, not just of the property, but of their lives. One crisp, clear afternoon, Elias, Mary, and Lydia stood on a small hill overlooking the ranch. The valley below was tinged with the green of new grass. It was a landscape of second chances. Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver locket. The marshals had recovered it from Blackwood's possessions. It was cleaned now, its surface gleaming in the sun. He handed it to Mary. She took it with a trembling hand and opened it. She stared at the faded portrait of her mother, a woman she barely remembered, and then at the portrait of herself as a fierce, hopeful girl. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. "He told me you'd thrown me away," she whispered, "that no one was looking for me." Elias put a hand on her shoulder. "I never stopped looking," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I just didn't know where to start." He looked from Mary to Lydia, his heart full. "We protect what matters together." Mary closed the locket and clasped it around her neck right where it belonged. As they stood there, a lone rider approached from the road, the mail carrier on his weekly route. He handed Elias a single official-looking envelope. It was from a territorial judge in a neighboring county. Inside, a letter detailed the final findings of the investigation into Silas Quinn's history. It included sworn testimony from one of the other captured gang members from all those years ago. The testimony stated unequivocally that Daniel Quinn's death was a tragic accident, a ricochet in the chaos, and that the posse, including Elias, had acted honorably. His name and his conscience were finally officially clear. He folded the letter and put it in his pocket. The last ghost of his past had been laid to rest. He looked at the two young women beside him, one his daughter by blood, the other by bond, and then out at the horizon where the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in hues of promise and hope. The long night was over. A new day was dawning.